For more than 4 centuries, the Ottoman Empire was not merely a state, it was a world power that decided the fate of continents. Its armies once stood at the gates of Vienna, its navy dominated the Mediterranean, and its sultans ruled over one of the most complex political systems in history. Yet by the 19th century, European diplomats no longer spoke of Ottoman strength. Instead, they whispered a dangerous phrase in the corridors of power: the sick man of Europe. This was not an observation, it was a warning. A warning that an empire still vast in territory had become fragile in structure, feared not for its power, but for its collapse. And the question that haunted Europe was not whether the Ottoman Empire would fall, but who would survive the moment it did. Why was the Ottoman Empire called the sick man of Europe? The phrase, the sick man of Europe, did not emerge as a casual insult, nor was it simply a reflection of military defeat. It was a calculated diplomatic label, born in the 19th century, at a time when the balance of power in Europe was shifting rapidly and the Ottoman Empire stood at the center of that transformation. The term expressed not the immediate collapse of the empire, but its perceived vulnerability, an empire still vast in territory, yet increasingly fragile in structure. The expression is most commonly attributed to Russian Tsar Nicholas I, who used it in conversations with European diplomats during the 1850s. His concern was not humanitarian, but strategic. The Ottoman Empire controlled critical regions, Balkan routes, Black Sea access, and the Eastern Mediterranean, that were essential to European trade and military balance. A sudden Ottoman collapse, Nicholas feared, would ignite conflict among the great powers. Thus, the empire was described as sick, not because it was dead, but because it was dangerously unstable. At the core of this perception was the growing gap between the Ottoman state and an industrializing Europe. While Britain, France, and later Germany were transformed by mechanized production, railways, and modern financial systems, the Ottoman economy remained largely agrarian. Traditional tax structures failed to generate sufficient revenue, foreign trade increasingly favored European merchants, and dependence on external loans grew steadily. By the mid-19th century, the empire had fallen into chronic debt, culminating in foreign control over its finances through institutions such as the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. Military weakness further reinforced the image of decline. For centuries, the Ottoman army had been a symbol of discipline and innovation. Yet by the modern era, its structures had stagnated. The Janissary Corps, once elite, resisted reform and modernization until its violent dissolution in 1826. Although new, Western-style armies were established, they struggled with inadequate training, outdated logistics, and limited industrial support. Defeats against Russia and other European powers exposed these weaknesses repeatedly and publicly. Administrative decay also played a decisive role. The empire's governing system, once flexible and merit-based, increasingly suffered from corruption, inefficiency, and decentralization. Provincial governors gained autonomy at the expense of central authority, while legal and bureaucratic systems failed to keep pace with social change. In response, Ottoman leaders launched ambitious reform programs, the Tanzimat and Islahat reforms, aimed at restructuring administration, law, and citizenship. Yet these reforms were often unevenly implemented and constrained by both conservative resistance and foreign interference. Equally important was the rise of nationalism within the empire's borders. Inspired by European political ideas, various ethnic and religious communities in the Balkans began to challenge Ottoman rule. Greece, Serbia, Romania, and Bulgaria sought autonomy or independence, frequently supported by rival European powers. Each uprising weakened the empire territorially and psychologically, reinforcing the notion that Ottoman sovereignty was eroding from within. Crucially, the label, the sick man of Europe, was not only descriptive, it was strategic. European powers used the empire's weakness to justify intervention, influence reforms, and redraw borders under the guise of stability. Britain and France, for example, often sought to preserve the Ottoman state not out of loyalty, but to prevent Russian expansion. The empire became an object of diplomacy rather than an independent actor, its survival managed rather than secured. Thus, the Ottoman Empire was called the sick man of Europe, not because it had ceased to function, but because its continued existence posed a problem to the European order. It was an empire caught between past glory and modern realities, alive, extensive, and resilient in many ways, yet unable to fully adapt to the forces reshaping the world around it. The phrase captured a moment when weakness became as geopolitically significant as strength, and when decline itself became a central issue of international politics. Internal weaknesses, economic, military, and administrative decline. The decline of the Ottoman Empire cannot be explained solely through foreign pressure or military defeat. Its most decisive weaknesses developed internally, shaped by economic stagnation, institutional rigidity, and the gradual erosion of effective governance. These structural problems did not appear suddenly. They accumulated over centuries and became impossible to conceal in the modern age. Economically, the empire struggled to adapt to a rapidly transforming global system. For much of its history, Ottoman prosperity depended on land-based revenue and agricultural production, supported by the Timar system, which tied military service to land grants. As warfare modernized and standing armies replaced feudal forces, this system lost its relevance. Yet no equally effective alternative emerged. Tax collection became inefficient, often outsourced to local tax farmers who prioritized personal profit over state stability. This led to widespread abuse, rural impoverishment, and declining state income. The Industrial Revolution widened this economic gap dramatically. European manufactured goods flooded Ottoman markets, undermining local artisans and traditional guilds. Capitulations, trade privileges granted to European merchants, exempted foreigners from many taxes and legal restrictions, placing Ottoman producers at a severe disadvantage. Over time, the empire became increasingly dependent on raw material exports and imported finished goods, a pattern that drained wealth rather than generating sustainable growth. To finance reforms and military expenditures, the state turned to foreign loans, entering a cycle of debt that culminated in the loss of financial sovereignty. Military decline was equally significant. Once renowned for innovation and discipline, the Ottoman army failed to modernize at the pace of European rivals. The Janissary Corps, originally formed to serve as an elite, centralized force loyal to the Sultan, gradually transformed into a conservative institution resistant to change. Their opposition to reform paralyzed military modernization for decades. When the Corps was finally abolished in 1826, the empire gained the opportunity to rebuild its army, but also lost experienced manpower without a fully prepared replacement. New armies modeled on European systems were introduced, yet modernization remained incomplete. Training standards varied, command structures were inconsistent, and industrial capacity was insufficient to supply modern weapons and logistics at scale. Repeated conflicts with Russia, particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries, exposed these deficiencies. Defeats were not merely territorial losses. They damaged morale and revealed the empire's inability to sustain prolonged modern warfare. Administrative weakness further undermined the state from within. The Ottoman governing system had once been praised for its flexibility, allowing local autonomy under centralized authority. Over time, however, this balance deteriorated. Provincial elites gained excessive power, often acting independently of the central government. Corruption became widespread, appointments were increasingly influenced by patronage rather than merit, and bureaucratic efficiency declined. In response, Ottoman reformers launched sweeping administrative reforms during the 19th century, known collectively as the Tanzimat. These aimed to centralize authority, standardize law, modernize taxation, and redefine citizenship. On paper, the reforms were ambitious and progressive. In practice, they faced resistance from conservative elites, religious authorities, and regional power holders. Implementation varied greatly across the empire, and reforms often remained confined to urban centers while rural areas saw little change. Compounding these problems was the empire's difficulty in managing social and ethnic diversity in an era of rising nationalism. Traditional systems of communal autonomy, such as the millet system, had long maintained stability by allowing religious communities to govern their internal affairs. However, as nationalist ideology spread, these arrangements proved insufficient. Administrative structures designed for imperial pluralism struggled to contain demands for political sovereignty. Ultimately, the Ottoman Empire's internal weaknesses were not signs of immediate collapse, but indicators of structural exhaustion. Economic dependency, military inadequacy, and administrative fragmentation interacted in ways that reinforced decline. Each reform attempt exposed new limitations, and each failure deepened the empire's vulnerability. By the late 19th century, the state continued to function, but no longer on its own terms. The foundations that once sustained imperial power had eroded, leaving an empire that appeared stable on the surface, yet increasingly fragile beneath it. Great powers and the Eastern question: managing a dying empire. As the Ottoman Empire weakened internally, its fate became inseparable from the strategic calculations of Europe's great powers. This international dilemma came to be known as the Eastern Question, a term that did not ask how the Ottoman Empire could be saved, but how its decline could be managed without destabilizing the European balance of power. The empire's survival, fragmentation, or collapse was no longer solely an Ottoman concern. It had become a central issue of 19th-century diplomacy. At the heart of the Eastern Question lay geography. The Ottoman Empire controlled vital corridors connecting Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, including access to the Black Sea, the Eastern Mediterranean, and key land routes through the Balkans. These regions were of immense strategic value. Any power that dominated them could influence trade, military movement, and imperial expansion. As Ottoman authority weakened, each great power sought to secure its interests while preventing rivals from gaining a decisive advantage. Russia played the most direct role in this struggle. Seeking warm water ports and influence over Orthodox Christian populations in the Balkans, Russia positioned itself as both protector and aggressor. Repeated wars against the Ottoman Empire expanded Russian influence in the Black Sea region and southeastern Europe. Yet Russian ambition alarmed Britain and Austria, who feared that a Russian-controlled Ottoman collapse would threaten their own strategic interests. Britain's policy was shaped primarily by maritime security and imperial routes to India. The British government viewed the Ottoman Empire as a necessary buffer against Russian expansion toward the Mediterranean and the Suez Canal. For this reason, Britain often supported Ottoman territorial integrity, even while criticizing its governance. The goal was not Ottoman strength, but Ottoman endurance, just enough stability to preserve British strategic advantage. France pursued a more complex approach. While advocating reform and modernization within the empire, France also sought cultural and political influence, particularly in the Levant and North Africa. French involvement often came in the form of diplomatic pressure, military intervention, and the promotion of Catholic interests. The occupation of Algeria in 1830 marked a clear transition from influence to outright imperial expansion at Ottoman expense. Austria-Hungary, and later Germany, approached the Eastern Question through continental stability and economic penetration. Austria feared nationalist unrest in the Balkans, which threatened its own multi-ethnic empire. Germany, arriving late to imperial competition, focused on economic and military partnerships, exemplified by railway projects and military advisory missions. These relationships strengthened Ottoman infrastructure but also deepened dependency. What united the great powers was a shared reluctance to allow the Ottoman Empire to collapse suddenly. A power vacuum could provoke war among rivals, as seen in repeated international crises and conferences. Thus, the empire was treated as a diplomatic problem to be managed rather than a sovereign state to be restored. Its borders were negotiated, its reforms supervised, and its finances increasingly controlled by foreign interests. This external management came at a high cost. Each intervention weakened Ottoman autonomy and reinforced internal instability. Nationalist movements gained foreign backing, territorial losses accelerated, and reform efforts became entangled with external demands. By the early 20th century, the empire remained intact in name but fragmented in reality. In the end, the Eastern Question was never truly resolved, it was merely postponed. The First World War provided the final stage on which decades of rivalry, intervention, and miscalculation played out. The Ottoman Empire did not simply fall, it was gradually dismantled by a system that sought to control its decline rather than confront its consequences.